Before we jump in and start learning the language, we really need to think about the intended result. Genuine bilingualism is not something to be taken lightly. Let's start with the end in mind. If you're going to learn Spanish, how are you going to keep that separate from English so you don't get them mixed up? And how are you going to make it so that you can learn more languages as well without confusing, say, your German or Portuguese vocabulary with your Spanish vocabulary? Well, let's take an analogy from English accents. Let's say you were raised in the US, but you want to mock a British accent. How are you going to do that? Are you going to think about all the nuances of the things that British people say and the way that they talk? The little rules like don't pronounce R's unless they're followed by a vowel? No, you don't even have to think about all those little rules. All you have to do is think of somebody else who speaks with a British accent and then imitate that person. And then you can also imitate an Australian accent, or an Irish accent, or a Scottish accent without getting them mixed up if you have separate people to imitate. You don't have to think about any rules. As long as you're familiar with each of these individual characters, you can imitate their individual voices. It's like a simple mental personality switch. Language learning is the same way. It's about imitation, and it's about putting on a different voice when you switch between the languages. This doesn't just help you keep them separate, but it can actually also help you not even think about the rules of the language because you're just switching into a natural voice that smoothly uses these rules, these tendencies, these idioms, so that when you're in that voice, you naturally speak that way. That's why one of the most powerful hacks for accelerated language learning and for effectively learning a language is to think of a memorable character who speaks the way that you want to speak using this language. So for us, in Spanish, our memorable character is a bee named Joel. Let's give him some personality and make him really memorable. Joel lives on the planet of Yol, and sometimes he gets his own name confused with the name of the planet that he lives on because they sound so similar. Joel is a mischievous bee, and while he tries to appear attractive and charming, he really just uses his wealth for his own selfish purposes, and he tries to get everyone else to do work for him because he's extremely lazy. Some details into his tastes. He loves drinking tea, and he'll do almost anything to get a nice hot cup. But he has a strong distaste for all mammals, that is, animals with fur, such as dogs, horses, bears, and giraffes. In fact, he's generally frightened of all such animals. However, his best friend is a lizard, and he has no problem with him because he's a reptile, not a mammal. As you'll see in future stories, the lizard can't talk and likes to live in dark caves. Joel also likes to hang out with a group of stuffed pandas. They're okay because they aren't real pandas, but they're living stuffed animals, which is not a problem by Joel's strange standards. Joel finds it particularly amusing to cause mischief to these stuffed pandas. He thinks it's funny when they get dizzy or blown around by wind, which happens pretty often. Now note that Joel has a strange tendency to get into a strange sort of mood and to talk with an old-fashioned or quaint mode of speech when he's about to do something mischievous. So be on the lookout for that. If he starts speaking in a pompous voice, it usually means that he's up to no good. Another funny thing about the way that Joel talks is that he has a tendency to be extremely redundant in certain cases. He'll say the same thing more than once in a sentence, sometimes even to the point of bad logic, such as double negatives. We have to imitate even this to speak like Joel authentically. Of course, in order to develop a voice like Joel's, one of the first things that we have to think about is the accent that he uses when he speaks. So Joel is a bee, and he has a long tongue, unlike humans. So instead of T, his T's are not formed against the roof of his mouth, but rather against his teeth, because his tongue goes so far forward in his mouth. So it's more like T. And then D is similar. It's more like the. Now, at the same time, his R kind of replaces the letters D and T. So his D and T are in the front of his mouth, but his R sounds a lot like our D and T when spoken really quickly, as in the T in the word water, spoken really quickly. It's like a cross between R and D for us, and unlike our which can go on for a long time, it's actually pronounced as a single moment event unless it rolls. Ere or ere. So looking at a couple of nonsense words like areda, instead of saying areda, it would be more like areda. You want to be able to imitate these sounds as soon as possible if you really want to sound like a native Spanish speaker. Every time you're in Spanish mode, try to speak the way that Joel does, because Joel represents standard Spanish pronunciation to us. We'll hear his actual voice very soon as he gives us some examples of Spanish sentences, but for now just keep these things in mind. So his T sounds like T, his D sounds like D, and his R is a single event, ar. Another letter that's different for Joel, the letter for J actually sounds like h, like H. Imagine that the letter J is hanging down in front of Joel's mouth and he's trying to blow it away. H. This is why Joel likes to call himself Yol sometimes and spell it with a Y instead of a J. When he tells his friends that his name is Joel, if he writes it out Joel, the word would end up calling him Hol, which he doesn't like very much. He thinks Yol sounds better. Now, Joel is a B, and the letter B for him buzzes a little bit, just like the letter V in English. In fact, for Joel, the letters V and B sound practically identical. Both are pronounced V. Just remember that Joel is a buzzing B, and that should help with both of these letters. Other than T, D, R, B, and J pronounced as H, h, Joel's consonants are very much like English consonants, except that Joel does not believe in the letter H. It looks too much like prison bars, which is something that Joel is always trying to avoid. So for Joel, H never makes the h sound, and it's basically always silent. Now for the vowels. Since Joel talks very quickly and directly, his vowel sounds are extremely short. If you put a silent H after the letters A, E, and O in English, you get the sound that Joel always uses for these letters. It never changes. A is always A, halfway between an A and an A. E is always E, sort of like A, but pronounced as a single sound, E. And O is always O. Quite simple for these three letters. I and U are a little different. If you think of an I and imagine that the little dot is Joel, the B, flying above the I, you can imagine that dot is Joel making a little sort of E sound as he's flying. That's the sound that the letter I makes in Spanish. So whenever he sees the letter I, he says E. You'll also quickly learn in the upcoming lessons that the letter U is U. Joel would never say you because all of the letters in Spanish have a single sound, so it's not as long and complicated as you, it's just a very simple single sound, U. So A, E, I, O, U are the 5 vowels. Now all of this is just an introduction of things to keep in mind. You'll actually get to hear Joel speaking very soon, and you can simply imitate the way that he talks in general for all new words. But practicing these with a few words can be helpful. So this word would be pronounced verdad. This one would be pronounced hola, remembering that he doesn't pronounce H's. This one would be pronounced mejor. This would be pronounced vida. This is todo. This is ahora, once again skipping that H. This is bien. And this is siempre. Remember to keep all the sounds very short and simple. Pronouncing any words you come across following these rules as simply and directly as possible will get you talking convincingly like Joel, and therefore like a native speaker, very quickly. So you can possibly practice this with any particular words that you come across and just try it yourself. Now, going beyond pronunciation, there are also some interesting nuances to the way that Joel talks and the way that he structures his sentences. So you'll want to pay close attention to him whenever he says something and be able to imitate the way that he says those. You don't want to have to think about all the rules all the time. Instead, you want to put yourself in Joel's frame of mind so that you can say things the way that he does in general. As some examples, he has a tendency to put his adjectives after his nouns instead of before his nouns about half the time. Not all the time, but in several situations that you'll pick up on soon. And then also, it's important to note that Joel does not like the word like. He'll pretty much say anything else that he can say instead of like. So instead of saying, I like food, he might say, to me, food is pleasing. Or instead of saying, I walk like he does, he would say, I walk as he does. Why is that? Simply because Spanish doesn't have a word for like. Instead, there are words for being pleasing to something, for wanting something, or for acting as something instead of acting like something. Also, for personal reasons, Joel avoids the ubiquitous English word get. He's very greedy and always looking to get things, especially if he can get them for free and without working, but he doesn't want people to know that he's always out to get something, so he almost always finds other ways to say get. There's a word in Spanish for the verb to get, but it's very uncommon, and Joel doesn't like to use it much at all, and only uses it when there's no other option. Now, before we dive in and start learning some actual Spanish words in the next video, we need to set the scene by talking a little bit about the planet of Yol, which is where Joel lives. The planet of Yol is a very strange planet. Everyone here speaks Spanish, but since they think that it was invented here on the planet of Yol, they call it Español, after their own planet's name. Yol is a warm but somewhat dim planet with a yellow sky. As you'll hear in upcoming stories, their currency is actually the Japanese yen. So you'll see people paying each other in yen all the time. In Joel's own neighborhood, there's an amusement park where he likes to hang out. There's a countryside which Joel has to walk through to get from the amusement park to the outdoor market. And then there are also hundreds of shops lining the streets close to Joel's home. Now, Joel's own house is very large, and again, he is a very wealthy bee. And so he has all kinds of stuff, both outside in his messy yard and inside his house. And inside they're organized by different rooms. You'll get to know these environments a lot better as we progress through the lessons, but keep that in mind. Joel has a local neighborhood and all these distinctly different places that he likes to visit. We'll start learning our first few words in the amusement park in the next video.